When I was about 8 years old, this was about this time of year, maybe a bit earlier, January, February, I took great pleasure in this gift that I had received at Christmas time. And this gift, it was called Super Slider Snow Skates. Has anyone ever heard of those? This is like 50 years ago. And they were wonderful. They were these little ski things you tie onto your boots and you could slide all over the place. And I had great fun doing this and going tobogganing with my buddies and so on. And so it afforded me great fun in the winter time. And I remember one Saturday evening about this time, going out into the back of the garage there where these Super Slider snow skates were stored. And I went to put them on and they weren't there. And I found out that my sister had taken them, my older sister. And I had basically what was a meltdown. I just, had a tantrum. I just couldn't believe that these Super Slider snow skates were gone. I couldn't have fun anymore, in my mind. And just angry at my sister, angry at life. And so I remember going out into the back field of our backyard there. And it was a field because our house was situated on a half-acre lot, and all the neighboring houses were also situated on the same size lots. And no one had fences. So there was this beautiful kind of pristine field of freshly fallen snow that I kind of walked out into and just fell on my knees. And I called out to God, God, why is life so unfair? Why can't I have my Super Slider snow skates? So just, crying, sobbing, just in my own little world, figuring that everything had just fallen apart, And then a moment later, I had this sense of peace kind of flooding over me. I remember it to this day, that I just had this kind of realization that despite this kind of, in my mind, agony that I was undergoing, I was going to be okay. That God had me, And that was kind of reaffirmed by looking up in the night sky, and seeing the stars and seeing this kind of just beautiful field of freshly fallen snow. And sort of feeling a sense of being reintegrated again, sort of being restored, if you will, reconciled. I never told my sister about this. I walked back into my house, into the house. My parents didn't know I had this powerful moment. I didn't really realize I'd had this powerful moment. But I can look back now, 50 years later, and realizing that was God, that somehow he had entered my soul in a powerful way and had really kind of helped me to kind of get things knitted back together again. During this time of year, during Lent, we're called to sort of focus on three aspects of our life, of our Christian life, of prayer, almsgiving, and fasting. And all of these have to do with cultivating and sort of uncovering this reality, this inner reality of our being. And here I'm talking about the reality of our soul. And I don't think it's something that we often consider living our human lives, That we're not just these kind of, if you will, kind of incorporated beings of blood, of bones, of tissue, and so on. That we are actually these ensouled beings. And that our soul is sort of the deepest, most kind of central core of our being. And that is exactly where God wants to kind of come to us and be with us. It's hard to describe what that thing is, but as Christians, we all know that it's there. That really it's the sort of the inner engine, if you will, the sort of the dynamism that kind of holds us all together. And so that when our life does sometimes tend to fall apart on one level, often on a kind of a surface level, that there's this inner stability that remains always reconciled, always integrated, always whole. And so what we have to do in our Christian life is always to kind of cherish that, to preserve that, if you will, to sort of hallow it, to protect it, to always make sure that kind of remains unviolated, if you will, that very kind of inner sanctum of our being. Because we know that's that trysting place, that meeting place, that where we can encounter the one who holds us in creation, who holds us in existence, who will never, ever let us go, who created us in the first place, and who's constantly kind of doing his activity, his work, his labor of always kind of holding us together, of always restoring us, always bringing us to this new life. This is, I think, something that we can, again, we have to sort of acknowledge, that we have to really kind of become aware of. And again, it's so easy to kind of shove this part or to push this part of ourselves to the side and live our lives more on a kind of a practical level, almost on a functional level. And on that level, we're often so often kind of trying to hold things together ourselves. Here we're talking about, just family life, our work, our various responsibilities, our school, our activities, our social circles, raising our children, just making sure the bills are paid, making sure that, there's a roof over our head, and these are all important things. But so often we can sort of just live on that level and sort of forget that there's this inner dynamism that is present in us that needs to be cultivated and tended to, cherished, hallowed, protected, and allowed to be animated and reawakened in us. And again, this is, I think, what Lent is all about. And I think, because I think when we do this, when we allow ourselves to go into that place, that inner sanctum, if you will, then I think we start to recognize and experience what Abraham had experienced in the first reading. Abraham, who realized that he was being called out of himself into a new life, into this, if you will, kind of a deeper dimension, a fullness of life that he couldn't have experienced if he just stayed in Ur, that land of the Chaldeans. And so there's this greatness, this glory, this fullness, this was being held out to him by God, and he was sort of out in that field, looking up at the stars, and God sort of held out to him his greatness, what he was being called into, that he was to become a source of blessing, not only for himself, but for the world, for all nations. And Abraham was left to simply trust, to believe that this is exactly what God wanted for him and from him. And it was very bewildering for him, wasn't it? He just didn't know what was up and what was down. That night he kind of felt this almost terror, But in the end, it says that God sort of bound himself to Abraham. And Abraham realized in that binding, in that covenant, that he would always remain reconciled, always whole, always integrated. He was aware again of that inner sanctum within himself, that trysting place again where God resides, where everything would always be okay. No matter what peril, no matter what adventure, God was going to call him forward to from then on. Right? And we know that whole story of how that unfolds in Abraham's life in the Old Testament, how it becomes the very beginning of this nation that becomes Israel, that then becomes the locus from which the Messiah, the Christ, is born into. So this is what each and every one of us kind of are really called to experience and to live also. Like Abraham, we are called to a greatness. We are called to a glory. Can we reconcile ourselves with that reality and that truth? In a world that often, though, seems to be kind of the opposite, if you think about it. Again, where we are just simply trying to glue things together on this kind of practical, functional level of living our lives. And it's hard, isn't it? Because often when we do that, we start to grasp for things that are going to lead us away from God, kind of lead us to forget that we should be existing from this inner sanctum, this place that we call our soul. And we so easily fall to all kinds of things, that we think is going to help us prop us up. And some of these things can actually become addictive, and quite destructive in our life, and kind of cause it to fall apart, very disintegrated, very divided, sometimes even desolate. So we need then this honesty, this truth, this acknowledgement of who we are as human beings, these ensouled beings. and spend time just kind of allowing that part of us to be awakened, to be reanimated. And again, this is exactly what Lent is all about, to reconcile ourselves to this part of our existence. Another word for this is simply prayer. It's just kind of opening ourselves to this deeper reality, this awareness of how God is always doing his work to hold us together, to reintegrate us, to restore us, to reconcile us to ourselves and to him. It's always an act of trust. Prayer is always an act of faith, just like Abraham did, just like Peter, James, and John did in the gospel. It's always an act of faith. And so I just invite you over this week, if you're not, to allow yourself to do that, to allow yourself to go to that place, if you will, of meditation, of contemplation, where you're not doing a heck of a lot. You're just trying to tune things out. All those stimulants that often, again, kind of grip our lives. And just try to turn off the TV, the internet, the radio, the computer, the cell phone, and just allow ourselves to be in that place. And to start being reconciled, as Paul says in that second reading, with our humanity, which sometimes can be quite humiliating when we recognize how vulnerable we are, so often how weak we can be. But in that truth, in that moment of truth, in that moment of defenselessness, knowing that somebody is so much bigger than us is working on us and working through us, providing us grace, providing us with all the means by which we can remain knitted together, reconciled. If we allow ourselves to do this, if we open ourselves to this, then I think we start to recognize this deeper depth of our humanity. And in that place of humility, of recognizing the truth of who we are, we can be drawn into that same glory that Jesus revealed to us in the Transfiguration.